Welcome, dear friends, to another journey through the sacred pages of history. Tonight, we find ourselves drawn to one of the most extraordinary chapters in the human story, a time when the very fabric of the natural world seemed to bend and shift, when the mighty empire of Egypt trembled before forces beyond their understanding, and when an entire people discovered what it meant to be called toward freedom. The 10 plagues of Egypt, ... Perhaps no other narrative in biblical history captures our imagination quite like this one. Rivers turning to blood, frogs covering the land, darkness so thick it could be felt. These are the images that have echoed through millennia, painted on countless canvases, retold in countless tongues. But tonight, we'll venture beyond the familiar Sunday school stories to explore the deeper currents that flowed beneath these miraculous events. What was it like to witness such wonders? How did the ordinary people of Egypt, servants and farmers, priests and scribes, make sense of their world as it transformed around them? What theological battles raged in the temples as the gods of Egypt seemed to fall silent, one by one? And what might modern science tell us about the natural phenomena that may have underlain these supernatural displays? So, before we begin our journey, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations of faith and history. And let me know in the comments what story resonates with you. It's always wonderful to see. Now, let's find a quiet space together and step back into a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural grew thin, where divine judgment and human resistance met in the ancient land of the Nile. Verse 1. A servant's day during the plague's daily life immersion. Imagine, if you will, that you are Kentia household servant in the estate of a minor Egyptian official in Memphis. Your hands know the weight of water jars, the texture of linen, the careful art of keeping a prosperous home running smoothly. For 23 years, you have risen before dawn to the same rhythms, the same certainties. The Nile rises and falls. The sun travels its eternal path across the sky. The gods maintain their watchful order over the black land. But today is different. You wake not to the usual sounds of birds greeting the dawn, but to shouting urgent, frightened voices echoing across the courtyard. Your master's voice, usually measured and dignified, carries a note of something you've never heard before. Fear. The river, he's saying to his wife, the river has turned to blood. You hurry to the window, your bare feet silent on the cool limestone floor. There, stretching toward the horizon like a wound across the earth, the Nile runs red. Not the muddy brown of the flood season, not the algae blooms you've seen before, but red, deep, thick, unmistakable red. The sacred river, the lifeline of Egypt, has become something else entirely. Your first thought is practical, as it always is. Water. The household needs water. You've maintained the cisterns well, but how long will the stored water last? You think of the fish, will they survive? The fishermen who supply your master's table, what will become of them? But as you watch, a deeper chill settles in your bones. This is not merely inconvenient. This is impossible. The morning routine continues, but everything feels fragile, temporary. As you sweep the courtyard, you notice the birds seem agitated, calling to each other in harsh, urgent tones. The servants whisper among themselves in clusters, their voices low, but their eyes wide. Everyone keeps glancing toward the river, as if they expect it to return to normal if they just check often enough. Your master sends you to the market with a bag of grain to trade for water. The streets of Memphis, usually bustling with merchants and craftsmen, feel subdued. People move in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. The water sellers, those who usually competed for customers, now command unprecedented prices. A single amphora of clean water costs more than your monthly wage. At the market, you overhear fragments of conversation that make your stomach tighten. The Hebrew slaves have something to do with this. Their God is angry. Moses and Aaron spoke to Pharaoh. You know these names. Everyone knows them now. The Hebrew brothers who had appeared in the royal court, demanding the release of their people. The stories had seemed almost amusing at first to ragged shepherds, challenging the might of Pharaoh, the living god of Egypt. But now, when you return to the house, you find your master in his study, surrounded by scrolls and looking haggard. He's been consulting the religious texts, trying to understand what deity might be responsible for this catastrophe. You've never seen him look so small, so uncertain. "Kenti," he says, not looking up from his papyrus, "what do the other servants say about this?" This sign? You hesitate. In your 2 decades of service, he's never asked your opinion about anything more significant than which linens to use for guests. But these are not ordinary times. They say it's the God of the Hebrews, Master. They say he's more powerful than our gods. Your master's jaw tightens. The gods of Egypt do not yield to foreign deities. This is some natural phenomenon. The priests will find an explanation, but you can hear the doubt in his voice. And that night, as you lie on your sleeping mat, you can hear him pacing in his chamber above, back and forth, back and forth. The next morning brings a new impossibility. You wake to find frogs, thousands upon thousands of frogs, covering everything. They spill out of the Nile, carpet the fields, hop through the streets. They're in the bread ovens, in the water jars, in the beds and chairs and sacred spaces of the temples. The sound is overwhelming, a constant wet croaking that seems to come from everywhere at once. You've lived by the Nile your entire life. You know frogs, but not like this. Never like this. Your master's wife screams when she finds them in her cosmetics box. The cook weeps as he discovers them in the grain stores. Even the cats, Egypt's beloved hunters, seem overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. They catch a few, then retreat to high places, watching the chaos with what you could swear looks like bewilderment. The practical problems multiply. How do you prepare food when every surface is covered with frogs? How do you draw water when the wells are teeming with them? How do you sleep when the sound never stops? But beyond the practical concerns, something deeper is happening. The order of things, the proper relationship between gods and mortals, between Egypt and its subjects, between the natural and the supernatural, is breaking down. The frogs are not just a plague. They're a sign that the world you've known is coming apart. Your master summons you again. This time, he's not alone. 3 other officials from the district have gathered in his reception hall, their faces grave. They speak in low tones about the Hebrew God, about Moses and Aaron, about Pharaoh's response. The king will not yield, one of them says. He cannot. To release the Hebrew slaves would be to admit that their God is stronger than ours. But what if their God is stronger? Another asks quietly. The silence that follows is deafening. In all your years of service, you've never heard Egyptian nobles speak such words. The gods of Egypt are eternal, supreme, unchallenged. To suggest otherwise is not just heresy, it's unthinkable. That evening, as you tend the oil lamps in the courtyard, you notice something else. The frogs have begun to die. Not gradually, not naturally, but all at once. Within hours, the living carpet becomes a rotting mass. The smell is unbearable. The sight is worse. Mountains of dead frogs line the streets, and the work of gathering and burning them seems impossible. You overhear your master's wife speaking to her sister. Perhaps we should offer extra sacrifices to Hecate. She is the goddess of fertility, of frogs. Perhaps she's trying to tell us something. But you notice that her voice lacks conviction. The old certainties are crumbling. As the days pass, the pattern continues. Gnats that rise from the dust itself, covering every living thing. Flies that swarm in such numbers that they darken the air. Each plague follows the same structure, an impossible natural phenomenon. A period of suffering, then either a gradual end or a sudden cessation that seems to come in response to some negotiation between Moses and Pharaoh. You learn to live with uncertainty. Water becomes precious. Food requires constant vigilance. Sleep comes in snatches between the sounds of buzzing insects or the cries of sick animals. But perhaps the most disturbing change is in your master himself. The confident, prosperous official who once spoke with casual authority about the god's favor has become a man who jumps at shadows. He consults omens constantly, makes offerings to deities he'd never paid attention to before, and asks questions that have no comfortable answers. Why do you think? He asks you one evening as you tend his evening meal. The plagues don't seem to affect the Hebrew quarter as severely. You've noticed this too. The Hebrew slaves, crowded into their section of the city, seem to suffer less from each plague. The water in their area clears first. The frogs avoid their homes. The flies seem less numerous there. Perhaps, you say carefully, their God protects them. Your master stares into his wine cup. Yes, he says finally. Perhaps. By the time the livestock begin to sicken and die, by the time the boils appear on the skin of every Egyptian, by the time the hail falls like stones from a clear sky, you have become a different person. The servant who once moved through life with quiet confidence, trusting in the order of things, has been replaced by someone who watches the sky with wary eyes and listens to every rumor about the Hebrew God. The darkness when it comes is unlike anything you've ever experienced. Not the darkness of night, which is familiar and peaceful, but a darkness so thick it seems to press against your skin. For 3 days, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The darkness is absolute, oppressive, suffocating. During those 3 days, alone in your chamber, you find yourself praying, not to the gods of Egypt, whose silence has become deafening, but to the God of the Hebrews. You don't know his name, don't know the proper words, but you whisper into the darkness anyway. If you are real, if you are truly more powerful than our gods, please, please let this end. When the light returns, you emerge blinking and disoriented. The world looks the same, but nothing feels the same. The old certainties are gone. The gods of Egypt, who once seemed so powerful, so present, have revealed themselves to be what? Silent? Defeated? Indifferent? And you know, with a certainty that settles in your bones like the morning chill, that this is not over. Whatever power has been unleashed in Egypt, whatever cosmic battle is being fought between the gods, the final act has not yet been played. As you go about your duties that first day after the darkness, you notice something else. The Hebrew slaves move differently now. There's an expectation in their posture, a readiness you've never seen before. They glance frequently toward the palace, toward the east, toward something beyond the horizon. And in the deepest part of your heart, you find yourself wondering what it would be like to walk away from everything you've known, to leave the familiar rhythms of Egyptian life and follow this strange, powerful God into the unknown. But those thoughts are too dangerous to hold for long. You are Kenti, a servant of Egypt. Your place is here, in this house, with these duties. The gods of Egypt may be silent, but they are still your gods. The Pharaoh may be struggling against forces beyond his understanding, but he is still the divine king. Isn't he? As you prepare for sleep that night, you cannot shake the feeling that everything you've known, everything you've trusted, everything you've built your life upon, is about to change forever. The plagues have been terrible, but they have also been warnings. And you sense, with a dread that makes your hands tremble as you extinguish the oil lamps, that the final warning is yet to come. Verse 2, Moses before Pharaoh biography, event narrative. To understand the true magnitude of what unfolded in Egypt, we must step back and consider the man who stood at the center of this cosmic drama. Moses, a name that is echoed through history, carrying with it the weight of prophecy, liberation, and divine encounter. But before he became the great lawgiver, before he led a nation through the wilderness, he was simply a man who had learned to live with exile, tending sheep in the wilderness of Midian. The Moses who approached Pharaoh's court was not the confident leader of popular imagination. He was 80 years old, his hair white, his hands weathered by decades of desert sun. His voice, he claimed, was halting not the golden tongue of a natural orator, but the careful speech of a man who had spent more years talking to sheep than to people. 40 years earlier, he had fled Egypt as a fugitive, his hands stained with the blood of an Egyptian overseer, his heart burning with a rage that had found no outlet but violence. Now he returned not as a conqueror or a political revolutionary, but as something far more unsettling, a prophet, bearing the word of a God that Egypt did not recognize. Picture, if you will, that first encounter. The throne room of Pharaoh is a marvel of human achievement, massive columns, painted in brilliant blues and golds, hieroglyphs that tell the story of divine kingship, the air thick with incense, and the whispered conversations of courtiers. At the center of it all sits Pharaoh himself, adorned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the living embodiment of divine authority on earth. Into this space of overwhelming power and pageantry walk two elderly shepherds. Moses, tall and lean, his shepherd's staff in his hand, his simple robes a stark contrast to the silk and gold around him. Beside him stands Aaron, his brother, chosen to speak the words that Moses feels inadequate to deliver. The contrast is almost absurd. Here is the most powerful man in the known world, ruler of an empire that stretches from Nubia to the Euphrates, whose word is law and whose person is considered divine. And here are two men who smell of the wilderness, who have spent their lives in the company of sheep and goats, who dare to make demands of the king of Egypt. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Aaron's voice rings out in the vast hall. Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. The silence that follows is pregnant with disbelief. The courtiers exchange glances. The guards tighten their grips on their spears. This is not how one addresses Pharaoh. This is not how politics works in Egypt. But Moses is not there to play politics. He has seen something that has changed him forever. A bush that burned without being consumed. A voice that called his name from the heart of the fire. A commission that seemed too enormous for any mortal man to bear. He has wrestled with his calling, argued with the Almighty, pleaded his inadequacy. But in the end, he has come to understand that this is not about his strength or his eloquence. This is about the power of the God who sent him. Pharaoh's response is predictable. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. In those words, we hear the collision of worldviews. For Pharaoh, the gods are known quantities powerful, yes, but part of a manageable system. They have their domains, their preferences, their proper forms of worship. They can be bargained with, appeased, manipulated through the right rituals and offerings. But this unknown God of the Hebrews threatens to upset the entire order. Moses understands the magnitude of what he's asking. He's not just requesting the release of a workforce. He's challenging the divine authority of Pharaoh himself. In Egypt, the king is not merely the representative of the gods. He is a god, the incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra. To defy Pharaoh is to defy the cosmic order itself. Yet here he stands, as former prince turned shepherd, speaking words that will either liberate a people or see him die in the attempt. The first sign, Aaron's staff becoming a serpent, is both a demonstration of power and a direct challenge to Egyptian theology. The serpent is a symbol of divine authority in Egypt, adorned on the pharaoh's crown, representing the protective power of the goddess Wajet. When Aaron's staff swallows the serpents produced by Pharaoh's magicians, it's not just a display of superior magic. It's a declaration that the God of Israel claims authority over the symbols of Egyptian power. But Pharaoh's heart, as the text tells us, is hardened. This is not simply stubbornness or pride, though both are present. This is the response of a man whose entire worldview is being challenged. To yield to Moses would be to admit that everything he has been taught about the gods, about his own divine nature, about the order of the universe, is false. So begins the duel not between Moses and Pharaoh, but between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. With each plague, the stakes rise. With each confrontation, the theological implications become clearer. This is not merely a labor dispute or a political negotiation. This is a cosmic battle for the soul of two nations. Moses, caught in the middle of this divine drama, reveals himself to be neither the confident hero of some traditions nor the reluctant prophet of others, but something more complex, a man who has learned to trust in a power greater than himself, yet who feels the weight of every moment, every decision, every word spoken in the presence of earthly and heavenly powers. Watch him as he returns to Pharaoh after each plague. There is no gloating in his manner, no satisfaction in Egypt's suffering. His face is grave, his movements deliberate. He understands that he is not the author of these events, but merely their instrument. The plagues that devastate Egypt bring him no joy. They are necessary acts in a divine plan that he can only partially comprehend. After the plague of blood, when Pharaoh's magicians manage to replicate the miracle with their secret arts, Moses sees the king's relief, the way his confidence returns. But Moses also sees something else, the first crack in Pharaoh's certainty. The king may dismiss this first plague as mere trickery, but his eyes betray a flicker of doubt. The Lord will show you who is God in Egypt, Moses tells him, and there is no boasting in his voice, only the weary certainty of a man who has seen the end of the story and wishes it could be different. The pattern repeats with each plague. Moses appears before Pharaoh, delivers the warning, watches as the king's heart hardens, and witnesses the consequences. Each time, there is a moment when it seems that Pharaoh might yield, when the suffering becomes too great, when the weight of evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. And each time, Moses sees the hope of resolution slip away as Pharaoh's resolve returns. It is during the plague of flies that we see, perhaps the most revealing moment. Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron, and for the first time, his voice carries a note of something approaching humility. "Go, sacrifice to your God within the land," he says. But Moses, with the wisdom of years and the insight of divine revelation, sees through this compromise. "It would not be right to do so," he replies. "The sacrifices we offer to the Lord our God are an abomination to the Egyptians. If we offer sacrifices abominable to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us?" Here we see Moses not just as a prophet, but as a diplomat, a man who understands both cultures and knows that true resolution cannot come through half measures. He has learned that God's purposes cannot be achieved through human compromise. "We must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness," he continues, "and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he tells us." In these words, we hear the heart of the conflict. This is not about the location of sacrifice. It's about the nature of freedom. Moses understands that his people cannot serve God while remaining in bondage, cannot worship truly while living under the authority of those who deny their God's supremacy. When the livestock begin to die, when the boils appear on Egyptian skin, when the hail destroys the crops, Moses becomes a figure of terrible solemnity. He takes no pleasure in these demonstrations of divine power. If anything, he seems to bear the weight of Egypt's suffering as heavily as that of his own people. It is Pharaoh's servants who begin to break first. "How long shall this man be a snare to us?" they ask their king. "Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" But Pharaoh, caught between the impossible alternatives of yielding to a foreign god or watching his kingdom crumble, chooses a third-path negotiation. He calls for Moses and Aaron again, and this time his tone is different. There is weariness in his voice, a recognition that the old certainties are failing. "Go, serve the Lord your God," he says. But which ones are to go? Moses' answer is absolute. "We will go with our young and our old. We will go with our sons and daughters and with our flocks and herds, for we must hold a feast to the Lord." This is the moment when the true nature of the conflict becomes clear. Moses is not asking for a temporary reprieve or a religious holiday. He is announcing in Exodus a complete departure from Egyptian authority, a rejection of the entire system that has defined the relationship between Egypt and Israel for centuries. Pharaoh's response is swift and angry. "The Lord be with you, if ever I let you and your little ones go. Look, you have some evil purpose in mind. No, go, the men among you, and serve the Lord, for that is what you are asking for." And with that, Moses and Aaron are driven from Pharaoh's presence. The pattern continues through the darkness, each encounter more tense than the last. Moses, who began as a reluctant prophet, has become something else, a man who has learned to speak with the authority of the divine, who can stand before earthly power without flinching, who understands that some battles can only be won through absolute commitment to divine truth. But it is in the final confrontation, as the shadow of the last plague begins to fall across Egypt, that we see Moses most clearly. He stands before Pharaoh one last time, and his words carry the weight of finality. "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle." The silence that follows is absolute. Even Pharaoh, master of rhetoric and divine authority, has no response to such words. This is beyond negotiation, beyond compromise, beyond the normal rules of diplomatic discourse. Moses continues, "There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there never was, nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." And then, in a moment that crystallizes the entire conflict, Moses delivers his final words to Pharaoh. "All these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, 'Get out, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will go out.'" The text tells us that Moses left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. But this is not the anger of wounded pride or frustrated ambition. This is the anger of a man who has seen too much suffering, who has watched a king choose destruction over humility, who knows that the final act of this drama will bring grief to every home in Egypt. As Moses walks out of the palace that night, he carries with him the weight of prophecy fulfilled and the terrible knowledge of what must come. He is no longer the reluctant shepherd who once argued with God at the burning bush. He has become something else, a man who has learned to trust in divine purposes even when they lead through darkness, who has discovered that true leadership sometimes requires the courage to deliver unwelcome truths to powerful people. The Moses who will lead Israel out of Egypt is not the Moses who entered it. He has been refined by confrontation, strengthened by divine encounter, and prepared for the greater challenges that await in the wilderness. But in this moment, as he prepares his people for the final plague and the deliverance that will follow, he remains what he has always been, a man who has learned to hear the voice of God and to trust in purposes greater than his own. Understanding. Verse 3. Scientific theories behind the plagues. Mystery, culture, technology deep dive. Now, as we step back from the intimate human drama of these events, let us consider a question that has fascinated scholars, scientists, and theologians for generations. What natural phenomena might have underlain these miraculous manifestations? This is not to diminish the spiritual significance of the plagues, but rather to explore how the divine might work through the very fabric of creation itself. The quest to understand the plagues through a scientific lens began in earnest during the 19th century, as archaeology began to unlock the secrets of ancient Egypt and our understanding of natural phenomena deepened. What emerged was not a simple debunking of the biblical account, but rather a complex picture of how extraordinary natural events might have created the conditions for divine intervention. Let us begin with the Nile itself, the lifeline of Egypt, the source of all prosperity, the river that the Egyptians considered divine. The first plague, the turning of the Nile to blood, has attracted numerous scientific explanations, each offering a piece of what might have been a catastrophic puzzle. The most compelling theory centers on what modern limnologists call a red tide, a phenomenon caused by massive algae blooms. In the case of the Nile, the likely culprit would have been Oscillatoria rubescens, a blue-green algae that, despite its name, produces a deep red pigment when it blooms in enormous quantities. This algae thrives in warm, nutrient-rich water with low oxygen levels, conditions that might have arisen from an unusually heavy flood season, followed by rapid recession. But for such a bloom to occur on the scale described in Exodus, something extraordinary would have been required. Some researchers have proposed that unusual climatic conditions, perhaps related to what we now understand as El Niño, patterns might have created the perfect storm of temperature and nutrient levels. The algae would have consumed the oxygen in the water, creating an anaerobic environment that would have been toxic to fish and other aquatic life. Yet even this explanation requires us to consider the timing. For the water to turn red throughout Egypt simultaneously, for the phenomenon to last exactly as long as described, and for it to affect stored water, as well as the river itself, suggests something beyond ordinary. Natural processes, perhaps the hand of the divine, working through natural means, but amplifying them far beyond their normal scope. The death of the fish would have been immediate and catastrophic in such conditions. The toxins produced by massive algae blooms can kill aquatic life within hours, and the smell of decomposing fish would have made the water undrinkable, even if the algae itself had not already accomplished that. This creates a cascading effect. Not only is the primary water source contaminated, but the protein source that the river normally provides is also destroyed. The second plague, the invasion of frogs, follows naturally from the first, in ways that would have been invisible to ancient observers, but are clear to modern ecology. When a river system becomes toxic to fish, the predators that normally control frog populations are eliminated. Adult frogs, being air-breathing amphibians, can survive the initial water contamination better than fish, but their habitat is still compromised. In such conditions, frogs exhibit what biologists call explosive breeding behavior, a desperate attempt to reproduce before their environment becomes completely uninhabitable. Millions of frogs would have emerged from the dying river, driven by instinct to find new water sources. They would have invaded human settlements, not out of supernatural compulsion, but from the basic biological need to survive and reproduce. The death of the frogs, described as sudden and simultaneous, fits perfectly with this ecological model. Frogs are extremely sensitive to environmental toxins, and the stress of displacement combined with exposure to whatever had poisoned the Nile would have created a massive die-off. The stench would have been overwhelming, and the sheer biomass of rotting amphibians would have created ideal conditions for the next phase of the ecological catastrophe. The third plague, gnats or lice rising from the dust, represents a fascinating intersection of biology and meteorology. When massive numbers of organic matter, in this case, dead frogs begin to decompose, they create perfect breeding conditions for various insects. The Hebrew word used, kinim, is difficult to translate precisely, but it likely refers to some form of biting insect that breeds in decaying organic matter. More intriguingly, some scholars have proposed that this plague might have involved sandflies or similar insects that emerge from the ground during specific atmospheric conditions. In Egypt, certain species of biting flies remain dormant in the sand until disturbed by vibrations or changes in humidity. A massive ecological disruption, combined with the right meteorological conditions, could have triggered the simultaneous emergence of billions of these insects. The fourth plague, the swarms of flies, continues this ecological cascade. With the normal predators dead or displaced, with vast amounts of rotting organic matter providing breeding grounds, and with the disruption of normal food chains, fly populations would have exploded beyond anything the Egyptians had ever experienced. The Hebrew text suggests these were particularly troublesome flies, possibly the stable fly or the sand fly, both of which are known to swarm in huge numbers under the right conditions. But here we encounter something that purely natural explanations struggle to address: the reported absence of these plagues in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. For this to occur naturally, the ecological conditions in Goshen would have had to be significantly different from the rest of Egypt. Some scholars have suggested that Goshen, being in the Delta region, might have had different water sources or soil conditions that made it less susceptible to the cascading ecological disaster. The fifth plague, the death of livestock, fits well within the framework of an ecological catastrophe. Animals that had been drinking contaminated water, breathing air filled with toxic insects, and grazing on vegetation affected by the environmental disaster would have been severely weakened. Anthrax, a disease that can lie dormant in soil for decades, might have been released by the environmental disruption. Alternatively, the stress and toxin exposure might have made the animals susceptible to diseases that would normally be manageable. The sixth plague, boils on both humans and animals, suggests a widespread outbreak of some kind of skin disease. Given the environmental conditions, contaminated water, massive insect populations, rotting organic matter everywhere, this could have been anything from bacterial infections spread by insect bites to fungal diseases thriving in the humid, contaminated environment. Some researchers have proposed that this might have been cutaneous anthrax, which can be transmitted through insect bites or contact with contaminated soil. Others suggest it might have been a form of plague, spread by the massive flea populations that would have thrived in the aftermath of the ecological disaster. The seventh plague, the devastating hail, brings us into the realm of meteorology. For hail to be so destructive that it destroys crops and kills livestock, it would have required an extraordinarily violent storm system. Such storms are rare in Egypt, but not impossible. The combination of unusual atmospheric conditions, perhaps related to the same climatic anomalies that might have triggered the water contamination, could have created the perfect conditions for a supercell thunderstorm. What makes this plague particularly intriguing from a scientific perspective is the biblical account's claim that the hail was mixed with fire. This has led some researchers to propose that the storm might have involved ball lightning or St. Elmo's fire electrical phenomena that can appear during severe thunderstorms. Alternatively, the fire might have been volcanic ash or debris from a distant eruption mixed with the hail. The eighth plague, the locusts, represents perhaps the most naturally explainable of all the plagues. Locust swarms are a well-documented phenomenon in the Middle East, capable of causing exactly the kind of agricultural devastation described in Exodus. What would have been unusual is the timing and scale. Locusts typically swarm when population pressures and environmental conditions create the right triggers. The ecological disaster of the previous plagues would have disrupted normal predator-prey relationships, potentially allowing locust populations to explode. The destruction of crops by hail would have concentrated the remaining vegetation, creating ideal conditions for locust aggregation. The ninth plague, the darkness that could be felt, presents one of the most intriguing puzzles for scientific explanation. Several theories have been proposed, each with its own compelling elements. The most dramatic possibility is that the darkness was caused by a massive volcanic eruption. The Mediterranean region has several active volcanic systems, and a major eruption could have sent ash clouds across Egypt, creating a darkness so thick it would have been almost tangible. The volcanic ash would have had a gritty, oppressive quality that matches the biblical description of darkness that could be felt. Another possibility is that the darkness was caused by a massive sandstorm, what the Egyptians called a khamsin. These storms can indeed create darkness so complete that it feels solid, and they can last for days. However, for such a storm to affect all of Egypt while leaving the Hebrew Areas untouched would require very specific meteorological conditions. Some researchers have proposed that the darkness might have been caused by a solar eclipse, though this seems less likely given the duration described. Others have suggested it might have been related to the same atmospheric conditions that created the unusual weather patterns throughout the plague sequence. As we consider these scientific possibilities, we must remember that the ancient Egyptians were not primitive people unaware of natural phenomena. They had observed the Nile for thousands of years, had dealt with floods and droughts, had experienced storms and pest outbreaks. For them to record these events as unprecedented supernatural occurrences suggests that whatever happened was far beyond their normal experience. The scientific explanations we've explored: the ecological cascade triggered by water contamination, the atmospheric conditions that might have created unusual weather patterns, the biological factors that could have caused massive insect and disease outbreaks, all point to something that, while working through natural processes, was far beyond the normal range of natural variation. Perhaps the most profound insight from this scientific investigation is not that the plagues can be explained naturally, but that they required such an extraordinary convergence of natural phenomena that the hand of the divine seems evident in their orchestration. The timing, the sequence, the scale, and the precision of these events suggest a coordination that transcends ordinary natural processes. Moreover, the ecological and meteorological explanations, while compelling, cannot fully account for the selectivity of the plagues, the way they seem to affect Egyptians while sparing the Israelites. This selectivity suggests that whatever natural processes were involved, they were guided by an intelligence that could direct natural forces with supernatural precision. As we reflect on these scientific possibilities, we find ourselves not with a choice between natural and supernatural explanations, but with a deeper appreciation for how the divine might work through the very systems of creation itself. The God who created the laws of nature is certainly capable of using those laws in extraordinary ways to accomplish divine purposes. The plagues of Egypt, viewed through the lens of modern science, become not less miraculous, but more so a demonstration of how the natural world, in all its complexity and interconnectedness, can become the instrument of divine will. The water that gives life can become the agent of judgment. The insects that normally serve as pollinators can become instruments of plague. The weather that usually brings blessing can bring destruction. In this understanding, we see not a God who violates natural law, but a God who is the author of natural law and who can orchestrate the symphony of creation in ways that reveal divine power and purpose. The plagues remind us that the natural world is not separate from the spiritual realm, but is the very stage upon which divine drama unfolds. Verse 4. The Egyptian priesthood responds contrasting perspective. To truly understand the magnitude of what unfolded during the plagues, we must step into the sandaled feet of those who bore the greatest theological burden during this crisis, the priests of Egypt. These were not merely religious functionaries, but the guardians of cosmic order, the interpreters of divine will, the men whose very existence depended on maintaining the delicate balance between the mortal and divine realms. Imagine yourself as Wasit, a high priest of Ptah in Memphis, one of the most ancient and revered deities in the Egyptian pantheon. You have spent 40 years rising through the ranks of the priesthood, mastering the complex rituals that maintain the cosmic order that keeps chaos at bay. Your temple is one of the wealthiest in Egypt, its walls covered with hieroglyphs that tell the story of divine kingship, its chambers filled with the sweet smoke of incense and the whispered prayers of countless generations. You wake on the morning when the Nile runs red, and your first thought is not of water shortages or dead fish, but of theological implications. The Nile is not merely a river, it is the physical manifestation of Hapi, the god of the flood, the source of all life in Egypt. For the sacred waters to turn to blood suggests that something has gone terribly wrong in the relationship between the gods and the people. Your first instinct is to consult the sacred texts, to perform the divination rituals that have guided Egyptian decision-making for millennia. You spread the casting bones on the altar, burn the prescribed incense, recite the ancient formulas. But the responses you receive are ... unclear. The gods, who have always spoken with authority through the traditional channels, seem strangely silent. As the day progresses, reports flood in from across Egypt. The river has turned red, not just in Memphis, but everywhere from the cataracts in the south to the delta in the north. This is not a local phenomenon that can be explained by regional divine displeasure. This is something that affects the entire cosmic order of Egypt. You summon the other priests of your temple, the readers of the sacred texts, the ritual specialists, the keepers of the sacred animals. Together, you perform the ceremonies of purification, the offerings of propitiation, the complex rituals designed to restore divine favor. But as the hours pass and the Nile remains red, a cold certainty begins to settle in your stomach. The old formulas are not working. That evening, you receive a summons from the palace. Pharaoh requires the presence of the high priests of all the major temples. As you make your way through the darkened streets of Memphis, you notice the people watching from their doorways, their faces grave with concern. They look to you, to your white linen robes, your ceremonial regalia, your assumed connection to the divine for answers you do not have. The palace throne room is filled with the most powerful religious figures in Egypt. The high priest of Ra from Heliopolis, ancient and venerable, his face etched with decades of ritual scars. The high priestess of Isis from Abydos, her eyes fierce with protective maternal authority. The priests of Thoth from Hermopolis, keepers of wisdom and sacred writing. All of them, like you, struggling to understand what is happening to their world. Pharaoh's words cut through the ceremonial courtesies with uncharacteristic directness. The Hebrew slaves speak of their God causing this plague. Our court magicians have managed to replicate their sign, with the staff becoming a serpent, but barely. Tell me, what power are we facing? The silence that follows is deafening. These are men and women who have spent their lives studying the divine, who know the names and attributes of hundreds of deities, who can recite the creation myths and the stories of divine conflicts that shaped the world. But this is beyond their experience. The high priest of Ra speaks first, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. The gods of Egypt are supreme, O living Horus. No foreign deity can challenge their authority in the Black Land. This must be some natural phenomenon, amplified perhaps by the magic of the Hebrew sorcerers. But even as he speaks, you can hear the doubt in his voice. The other priests murmur agreement, but their words lack conviction. You have all seen the Hebrew leaders, Moses and Aaron, standing before Pharaoh. They do not look like sorcerers. They look like prophets. And that realization chills you more than any magical display. Over the following days, as the plagues continue to unfold, the theological crisis deepens. Each plague seems to target a specific aspect of Egyptian religious life, as if the Hebrew God understands the Egyptian pantheon intimately and is systematically dismantling it. The frogs, emerging from the Nile in impossible numbers, are sacred to Hecate, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. But instead of bringing blessing, they bring chaos. The goddess who should protect and nurture has become an agent of disruption. You perform the rituals of Hecate, offering the prescribed bread and beer, burning the sacred oils. But the frogs continue to swarm, and when they die, their rotting bodies create a stench that makes the temple almost uninhabitable. The gnats that rise from the dust strike at the very heart of Egyptian cleanliness rituals. Priests must be pure to serve the gods, washed, shaved, dressed in clean linen. But how can you maintain ritual purity when biting insects cover every surface? For the first time in your adult life, you are forced to conduct ceremonies while covered in insect bites, your clean robes stained with blood and dirt. When Pharaoh summons the magicians to replicate this plague, you watch with growing unease as they fail. The court sorcerers, men whose abilities have always been sufficient to explain or counter supernatural phenomena, throw down their staffs and declare, "This is the finger of God." The words hang in the air like a death sentence for everything you have believed about the supremacy of Egyptian magic. The flies that swarmed through Egypt seem to avoid the Hebrew quarter entirely. You personally travel to Goshen to investigate, and what you find there shakes you to your core. The same sun shines on Hebrew and Egyptian alike. The same wind blows through both communities. But the flies that make life miserable for Egyptians seem to part around the Hebrew settlements like water around a rock. This selectivity is what truly terrifies you. Natural disasters can be explained, even extraordinary ones. But supernatural precision, the ability to direct natural forces with such accuracy that they affect one people while sparing another, this suggests a level of divine power that challenges everything you have been taught about the nature of the gods. You begin to study the Hebrew God with the same intensity you once applied to Egyptian theology. You question Hebrew slaves who work in the temple, trying to understand the nature of their deity. What you learn disturbs you profoundly. The Hebrew God is not like the Egyptian gods. He is not part of a pantheon, not limited to a particular domain or geographical region. He claims to be the creator of all things, the source of all power, the ultimate reality behind all existence. This is not polytheism. This is something else entirely. Moreover, the Hebrew God seems to be actively involved in human history in ways that the Egyptian gods are not. Ra follows his daily path across the sky. Ptah maintains the order of creation. Isis protects the dead, but they do so according to eternal patterns, not in response to specific historical circumstances. The Hebrew God, by contrast, seems to intervene directly in human affairs, to have purposes and plans that unfold in time. When the livestock begin to die, you realize that the Hebrew God is systematically attacking the animal cults that are central to Egyptian religion. The sacred bulls of Apis, the cats of Bastet, the ibises of Thoth, all are dying alongside common farm animals. The gods who are supposed to protect these sacred creatures are powerless to save them. You stand in the temple of Apis, looking at the dying sacred bull, and for the first time in your life, you question whether the gods you have served are truly divine. The bull that was supposed to be the physical manifestation of Ptah lies gasping in the straw, its eyes clouded with disease, its breath coming in ragged gasps. If Ptah cannot protect his own sacred animal, what kind of god is he? The boils that appear on your skin are not just painful, they are theologically devastating. Priests must be physically perfect to serve the gods. Any blemish, any deformity, any disease disqualifies you from temple service. But every priest in Egypt now bears these marks. If the gods cannot protect their own servants from disfigurement, what does that say about their power? You try to continue the temple rituals, but your hands shake as you perform the ceremonies. The words that once came easily now feel hollow in your mouth. The offerings that once seemed to please the gods now seem meaningless. You are going through the motions of worship, but the connection between ritual and reality has been severed. The hail that destroys the crops is accompanied by fire, not the gentle, warming fire of the sun god Ra, but a destructive, consuming fire that speaks of judgment rather than blessing. As you stand in the temple courtyard, watching the sacred sycamore tree split under the assault of ice and flame, you realize that the natural order itself is being rewritten. The locusts that devour what remains of the crops complete the systematic destruction of Egyptian agriculture. These insects do not simply eat, they consume everything green, leaving behind a landscape as barren as the primordial chaos that existed before the gods created order. You watch them strip the sacred groves around the temples, devouring the plants that have been carefully tended for centuries. But it is the darkness, the thick, oppressive darkness that seems to press against your skin, that finally breaks your theological certainty. This is not the gentle darkness of night. when Ra travels through the underworld to be reborn at dawn. This is the darkness of unbeing, the primordial void that the gods supposedly conquered at the beginning of time. For 3 days, you sit in your chambers, unable to see your hand before your face, unable to perform any rituals, unable to do anything but think. And in that thinking, you come to a terrible conclusion. The Hebrew God is not challenging the gods of Egypt. He is revealing them to be powerless. The theological implications are staggering. If the gods of Egypt are not truly divine, then the entire foundation of Egyptian civilization is built on a lie. The Pharaoh's divine authority, the temple system, the complex rituals that supposedly maintain cosmic order, all of it becomes meaningless if the gods are not real. You emerge from the darkness a changed man. Physically, you look the same white linen robes, the same ceremonial regalia, the same ritual scars. But inside, everything has changed. You continue to perform your duties as high priest, but you do so with the mechanical precision of a man going through familiar motions rather than the passionate conviction of a true believer. When other priests speak of fighting back against the Hebrew God, of finding ways to counter his power, you remain silent. You have seen enough. This is not a conflict between equals. This is a demonstration of absolute power by a deity who operates on a completely different level than the gods of Egypt. Some of your fellow priests refuse to accept this reality. They perform increasingly elaborate rituals, make increasingly costly offerings, recite increasingly complex spells. But you notice that their efforts become more desperate as they become less effective. The gods of Egypt, if they ever had power, are not responding to their servants' pleas. You begin to understand something that your theological training never prepared you for. The possibility that there is only one true God and that all other so-called deities are mere human creations. The Hebrew God is not defeating the gods of Egypt. He is revealing that they never existed in the first place. As you prepare for what you sense will be the final plague, you find yourself in an impossible position. Your entire identity, your social status, your understanding of reality itself is built on the priesthood of gods who may not be real. To abandon your position would be to lose everything: your livelihood, your purpose, your place in Egyptian society. But to continue serving gods who have proven powerless is to live a lie that becomes more obvious with each passing day. You are trapped between a truth too terrible to accept and a lie too obvious to maintain. On the night when the angel of death passes through Egypt, you lie awake in your chambers, listening to the sounds of grief that echo through the city. Every Egyptian household mourns a firstborn, but not a single Hebrew family is touched. The selectivity that has characterized all the plagues reaches its ultimate expression. In the morning, you stand in the temple of Ptah, surrounded by the trappings of a religion that has suddenly become obsolete. The God who is supposed to be the creator of all things has been powerless to protect even his own priests. The cosmic order that you have spent your life maintaining has been revealed as a human construct with no divine foundation. As the Hebrew people prepare to leave Egypt, you watch from the temple walls. They move with the confidence of a people who have seen their God act in history, who know that they are under divine protection. Your own people, by contrast, move like survivors of a catastrophe, trying to rebuild a world that has been fundamentally shaken. You realize that Egypt will never be the same. The plagues have not just damaged the economy or killed people, they have destroyed the theological foundation of Egyptian civilization. The gods have been revealed as powerless. The Pharaoh's divine authority has been challenged, and the entire worldview that made Egypt great has been called into question. In the years that follow, you will continue to serve as high priest, but you will do so with the knowledge that your gods are silent because they do not exist. You will perform the ancient rituals, but you will know that they are merely human traditions with no divine power behind them. You will speak of the gods' favor, but you will remember the Hebrew God who demonstrated power that your deities could not match. The plagues of Egypt did not just free the Hebrew slaves. They revealed the fundamental truth about divine power that changed the course of human history. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not merely one God among many, but the only true God, the source of all power, the ultimate reality behind all existence. And you, Kamwasit, high priest of a powerless God, will carry this terrible knowledge for the rest of your life. The knowledge that you have spent your years serving a lie, and that the truth walked out of Egypt with the Hebrew slaves, never to return. Conclusion. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of our journey through one of history's most profound encounters between human power and divine purpose. We have walked with Kenti through the streets of Memphis, feeling the weight of impossible wonders pressing against the fabric of ordinary life. We have stood with Moses before the throne of Pharaoh, witnessing the collision of worldviews that would reshape the ancient world. We have explored the natural phenomena that might have provided the stage for supernatural drama, and we have felt the theological crisis that shook the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. The plagues of Egypt were not merely displays of divine power, they were revelations of divine character. They showed a God who hears the cries of the oppressed, who acts in history to accomplish purposes of justice and liberation, who demonstrates that no earthly power, no matter how great, can ultimately resist the will of the Almighty. But perhaps most importantly, they revealed the fundamental truth that would echo through the centuries, that there is only one true God, and that all other claims to divinity are human constructions that cannot withstand the test of reality. The gods of Egypt, so powerful in their temples and so revered in their rituals, were revealed to be nothing more than stone and gold, unable to protect their people or even their own priests. As we reflect on this ancient story, we might ask ourselves what false gods we serve in our own time, what powers we trust in that might prove as powerless as the deities of Egypt. The plagues remind us that ultimate reality lies not in human constructions of power and meaning, but in the God who created all things and who continues to work in history to accomplish purposes of justice, mercy, and truth. The Hebrew slaves who walked out of Egypt that night did not just gain their freedom, they carried with them a revelation that would change the world. They knew, as no people had ever known before, that their God was not merely their tribal deity, but the Lord of all creation, the source of all power, the ultimate reality behind all existence. And in quiet moments like these, as we sit in the peaceful darkness of evening, we too can sense the presence of that same God, not dramatic and overwhelming as in the plagues, but gentle and constant, working in our lives and in our world with the same love and purpose that led the Hebrew people out of bondage and into freedom. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the sacred pages of history. May you find in these ancient stories the timeless truths that speak to every generation. And may you rest tonight in the knowledge that the God who heard the cries of Hebrew slaves still hears the prayers of his people today. Until we meet again in these quiet explorations of faith and history, may your sleep be peaceful and your dreams filled with wonder. This is the Shepherd's Candle, your tour guide through history.